In this lecture, we start another two-part series, this one concerning internet terminology. In part one, we are going to discuss the beginning of the internet, and then we are going to look at interpreting web addresses and browser terminology. The beginning of the internet, as far as we need to be concerned for the CIPP US, began with ARPANET. ARPA, an acronym standing for Advanced Research Projects Agency. ARPANET was a military computer network, and it first connected between Stanford and the University of California, Los Angeles on October 29, 1969. Way back then, the internet was intended to transmit data between two secure points. That's really important to understand because when the internet was conceived, it was not designed with security in mind. That's why we have so many security problems today, because 50, 60 years ago, when folks started thinking about the internet, they thought, well, this is only going to be used by a dozen or so people, huh? We don't need to build in security, huh? And so we have all the problems we do today. The only way to really fix all of those security problems are, just be to blow everything up and start over from scratch. So maybe after the zombie apocalypse. With regards to web addresses, there are a few different parts of the web address you need to know and some associated terminology. The www at the start of any web address stands for World Wide Web, and it's how we share information. In contrast to the World Wide Web, we have the Internet. And the Internet, despite popular usage, actually refers to the physical infrastructure across which we share information. This includes cables, routers, switches, cell phone towers, satellites, etc. URL is an acronym that stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and we're going to look at an example of that in just a moment. A hyperlink is a URL that has been embedded into a web page or an email. And finally, protocol is a foundational technology and concerns how data is transferred across the internet. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. The difference between those two is that HTTPS encrypts data using SSL or LS. Secure Socket Layer is SSL, and Transport Layer Security is TLS. The difference between those two is that TLS is just a new version of SSL, but you often see SSL, TLS together. And encryption is a mathematical process to encode data. And I have a little diagram down here to try and explain at a very high level how encryption happens. So remember, the internet was designed without security in mind. You were going to have government base A and government base B. They were going to be already highly secured. And of course, no one was going to be able to access the infrastructure between these 2 points. And so you didn't have to worry about security, right? Because everything was already inherently secure. So imagine that we have this individual over here, and they want to send a message to this person over here using the internet. Well, what encryption does is it takes the message and it applies a cryptographic algorithm to that message, which encodes it. The message is then transported over the internet, lands over here. This person has the key to decrypt the message, and voila. Now individual B can read the message. That's how encryption happens. And so what this does is it preserves the confidentiality of a message as it traverses the physical infrastructure of the internet. If that message were to be by a bad actor, because it's been encrypted and because person A and person B have the only keys to decrypt that data, then the data is essentially meaningless to that person, to the bad actor. This is a web address. I'm pretty sure you've seen one of these before. You don't need to know all of these different parts down here, the protocol, the subdomain, the root domain, top level domain, subdirectory. I just threw those in case you want to get nerdy with me. Those are the different parts of the web address. The only thing you need to know for the CIPP US is what a URL is, and if you were shown something like this and given multiple possible answers, you would be able to select the correct one. Now let's talk about some browser terminology. A browser is an application used to surf the web. Popular examples include Chrome, Firefox, Safari, DuckDuckGo, and Edge. What a browser does is it interprets HTML code, and we're going to look at an example of some HTML code and how that's interpreted in just a moment. With regards to the CIPP US, you need to know that the US National Center for Supercomputing Association, the NCSA, developed the first browser, which was Mozilla, and Mark Andreessen, an NCSA student, later developed Netscape. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. This is a coding language that creates and formats a web page. The browser then interprets all of that code and shows you pretty pictures. HTML was developed in the 1990s by Sir Tim Berners. He was a British physicist. The current version of HTML is HTML5. It differs with some of the original versions because HTML5 allows audio, video, mobile devices, and has improved security. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. This is a language that's used to store and transport data. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. This is another programming language for web design that is complementary to HTML. And often web designers will use CSS and HTML together. This is an example of how you can view the HTML and CSS of any web page you visit. In my example here, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner over here, I use Chrome and I use DuckDuckGo. And in these contexts, I can simply right-click on the web page, scroll down to where it says Inspect, and click on Inspect. And if you do that, your web browser will split into multiple columns. And if you look on the right-hand side over here, you'll see all of the HTML and CSS code. So this is the raw code, and what your browser is doing is your browser is receiving all of this input, and the output is the beautiful web page that you're watching this video on, for example. In this lecture, we briefly discussed the beginning of the internet. You need to remember ARPANET and that the internet was not designed with security in mind. We then looked at interpreting web addresses. We discussed www, the internet, URL, hyperlink, protocol, HTTP and HTTPS, and encryption. And we ended by discussing web browsers. We defined what a browser is. We noted the National Center for Supercomputing Association, NCSA, and how Mozilla is related to that. We mentioned that Mark Andreessen was a student at NCSA and developed Netscape. We also unpacked HTML and contrasted HTML with HTML5. Again, you need to remember Sir Tim Berners-Lee was responsible for developing the HTML coding language. We also talked very briefly about XML and CSS. You need to remember all of these terms for the exam. Good luck, and see you in part 2.